I'm honored to be keynoting. It's rare that I get the opportunity, so I want to do my best to take it seriously and show you guys some interesting stuff. Hopefully you can take home and use at your work. Ordinarily, this is where I say thank you for getting up super early, because these are normally like 9 a.m. talks, but I'll say it anyway. Thank you for getting up and coming to this thing, because the first talk of the con is usually, scant participation. Today we're talking about circumnavigating security culture and language. Briefly, my name is Dan Tentler. I run a security company called Phobos Group. The short version is basically we simulate espionage for a living. I'm an aspiring Bond villain. I would like to begin with an interesting question. Who here knows what a shell is? Lots of people know what a shell is. What is a shell? Somebody shout.
Remote administration.
Close? No. Audience participation. Throw things, throw knives, cupcakes, whatever you want. Don't be shy. That's right. The colloquially agreed upon definition for a shell is a command line interpreter. Does anybody know why it is actually called a shell?
You'll have to ask more.
Theories, ideas? Nothing? Okay. In 1976, there was an operating system called Multics. And Multics operated differently than how normal operating systems function today. Multics was, while it was multi-user, it wasn't really multi-process. And the way that Multics functioned is your command line interpreter, if you wanted to run code, if you wanted to run something besides your CLI, you would run it. And the way that functioned in memory was that it would read the code off of disk, it would import the code into its own memory space and run it inside of its own process. So today, if Windows box, Linux box, Mac, whatever, you pop open a command line and you run a thing, it spawns a new process. Well, in Multics, that didn't happen. In Multics, the command line interpreter was literally just scaffolding that would reach out, grab code, and then import it into itself to then run it, thereby calling, it was colloquially known as a shell because the command line interpreter was just a shell, and it would go and fetch code and run it inside of itself. Fun thing. It's a lot of people use the term shell. A lot of people like shells. Not a lot of people know why it's called a shell. Fun time. So now you can go and gloat trivia-wise to your friends. So I spend a staggering amount of time on the internet, if it's not horrifically and embarrassingly obvious already. I haven't had cable in something like 10 years, and since cutting the cord, I found that all the time that I used to spend sat squarely in front of the television imbibing shows and crappy advertising, is spent a lot more fruitfully today on the internet, picking and choosing what I feel like learning. So it turns out at some point you begin to see that there's a lot of congruency across multiple disciplines, and I've noticed quite a lot about how scientists do science and how we do InfoSec. There's quite a lot of congruency there, and it started to get me thinking. And my intention is to hopefully get you all to think about this a little bit as well. So as a thought exercise, what I'd like you to do for me is I'd like to imagine something. Imagine that your entire range of expertise, everything you know, all the things you're good at, all the stuff that you do, is this little alcove in a rainforest. Everything is arm's reach away. Everything is visible. You can navigate this place in your sleep. You live here. This is your home. This is your comfort zone. You are an expert in this domain. You understand that this is a clearing, or an alcove rather, in a rainforest, but you seldom explore outside of this area yourself because this is where you live. This is your home. So next I want you to imagine that I've given you a hot air balloon. And imagine that you can get into this hot air balloon and simply ride it straight up, and we'll just say for the sake of argument that it is unaffected by wind or other weather and just travels straight up and down. Imagine as this balloon rises, you clear the treetops for the first time, and you get an idea of just how massive this forest actually is. It sprawls out to the horizon as far as the eye can see and beyond. You quickly can see other little alcoves that you had no idea existed before you were able to get this new point of view. As you look down, you can see how some parts look just like what you know, and other parts look completely foreign. You'll see new little bits and pieces that you've never seen before, and there's little alcoves of information scattered all over the place. At some point you begin to see patterns and you realize just how much of this forest you have yet to explore, and the sheer staggering volume of data weighs on your mind as you come to realize how much you know versus how much you have still yet to discover. And as the balloon continues to gain altitude, you can see patterns beginning to emerge, and at a high level you can see that in some circumstances there are copies of things with slightly different shapes or colors. You can see massive physical boundaries, and certain things that used to be perceived as insurmountable obstacles seem like distant small specks, and they're very easy to grapple with. You'll begin to discover additional patterns in the landscape that give you an idea that if you learn the right things, you can overcome these insurmountable obstacles and this new perspective on your environment. You have a rough idea where you need to go to explore to get a better idea of what the challenges are to overcome the obstacles. So as you notice these patterns, you start to see different regions, and you can start to recognize them as bodies of knowledge. And as you continue to look, you can start to see how these bodies of knowledge are all interconnected. Seeing things from this new point of view gives you the framework for understanding things at a very high level and how they work together, and you can work backwards from there to extrapolate the things in between given enough time. It is only at this point you begin to know how much you know that you don't know. So one of these little alcoves I have discovered on the YouTubes is this guy. His name is Jordan Peterson. He's a professor at Toronto, University of Toronto, and he spends a lot of time lecturing at a variety of different colleges, including places like Harvard and Yale. There's a segment of the interview of this particular video that was pretty striking, I found, and it serves as a great example of discovering further new alcoves of information outside of the ones that you're comfortable in your little jungle alcove. And this, I believe, serves as this luminous, amazing, shining example of how to grapple with this sort of imbibing new information. He explains effectively that there's nothing more powerful in the world than someone who can think and speak. If you're a master at formulating your arguments, you win everything. And even better than that, when you win, those around you win as well. If you transform yourself into something that is articulated, sensible, grounded in history, knowledgeable, and wise, you can do anything you want. If you learn to think, learn to speak, and learn to read, it makes you a superpower. Another nice little alcove I've discovered, I've probably spent an unhealthy amount of time on, is Veritasium, if anybody that's heard of Veritasium. This guy's name is Derek. This video, he describes a really interesting thing that some people in the room may be familiar with, all you mail admins. Mail system admins. He describes the Bayesian theorem and how it works, like Bayesian filtering. Bayesian filtering, for example, is how modern day spam filtering works. And it's applied to that, its application to email filtering was derived from its greater function. The Bayesian theorem effectively is a broad idea that people can use to calculate dealing with the introduction of new information into a given system by way of using a bunch of math and common sense. So the concept here is that we reevaluate our position based on new data as it becomes available to us. And as an example, he described a problem. Imagine that you go to the doctor, and imagine that you have a test done for an illness, and the test is 99% accurate. The test comes out positive, which suggests that you have the illness, and this disease is known to affect 0.1% of the population. What is the actual probability that you have the disease given the accuracy? Most people would say 99% because the test is supposed to be 99%, right? Or 99% accurate. So Bayes' theorem helps us decide what the actual likelihood is. You start with a given hypothesis, in this case, that you're actually sick, and an event that you tested positive. Then to calculate this, you take the prior probability of the hypothesis being true, basically how likely you thought that you had this disease, which we know generally affects 0.1% of the population, so 1 in 1,000. You multiply that by the probability of testing positive for the disease if you actually had it. Now you divide that result by the probability of actually testing positive, which turns out to be a bit more work and needs to be extrapolated out because that figure is a combination of the probability of you having the disease and correctly being tested positive, plus the probability of not having the disease and being falsely identified. So a reasonable place to begin is, just to plug in the numbers, is to start with the actual probability of you being infected as the general population figures, so we'll start with 0.1%. And then we plug in the rest of the numbers, since we know you were tested positive, the test is 99% accurate and the disease affects 0.1% of the population, you plug in all the numbers, you get the math, it turns out you actually have a real probability of 9%. So given the figures, as high and as scary as they sound, a 0.1% of the population can have this disease combined with a 99% accurate test, the result is 9%. You're scratching your head. You're like, wait, how does this make sense? Because the test is 99% accurate. Okay, so it turns out that if you actually just use figures like shapes instead of numbers, it's a lot easier. It's common sense basically applied to math, right? So here's the here's the lowdown. So if we start here, we're 1,000 people, right? This is our sample size. Presumably, one person of this sample size actually has the disease legitimately because this disease affects 0.1% of the population. However, the test is only 99% accurate, which means 10 people were going to be falsely diagnosed as having the disease when they don't, right? So these are 10 false positives plus the one person that is actually carrying the disease, which means that our result size is 11 people, where one person out of 11 actually has the disease. And 1 in 11 is roughly 9%. So you're like, all right, well, I don't like these figures. This is bullshit. I want to go get a retest, right? I'm going to go to the doctor. This is dumb. We're going to do it again. So you can go through and do exact same math again. So now instead of starting with 0.1%, you start with 9%. And it's the same math all over again. You do it one more time, plugging in the new numbers, and now you're just shy of 91% certain that you have the disease, right? So figure this way, two different tests from two different labs for the same thing, both testing positive, it is unlikely to be chance, and now you have a basis for a process by which you can evaluate new data to determine probability, right? And you can apply this sort of wrapper to practically anything. So what does all of that have to do with words and their meanings? Well, this is how we process information on a daily basis, as it turns out. And when we use the internet, when we communicate with each other on social media, specifically in this case, within the information security ecosystem. These are the physics by which we govern how we talk to each other and how we imbibe new information, process it, and give weight to that information. So let me explain. This is the internet. The GIF should be GIFing? Yeah, this is the internet. From a ways away, it looks really pretty and obviously has very vibrant wildlife. But just like a real jungle, it is not all pretty flowers, nature hikes, and hammocks. It's got spiders that eat bats. It's got fungus that will take over the brains of ants, make them climb very high so that it can crack open their heads and release its spore. And it literally has monsters big enough to eat you. So it's probably a good idea to know what you're getting into and make some effort to be prepared and being articulate and understanding how to imbibe new data, how to process it, how to give it weights and value, apply very directly to who we are as information security practitioners and how effective we are at what we do. Not all data that we take in is good or valid, so we have to be realistic about this stuff. So first and foremost, the things you contribute to the internet are very difficult to remove. Third-party sites will mirror your social media posts. They will get archived, things like the Wayback Machine, things like Google Cache, Internet Archive, people taking screenshots, you name it. People can save forum threads. There's archiving tools all over the place. In some circumstances, something you say publicly can and will be used out of context without your consent. There's a lot of doom and gloom reporting in information security, and it generates ad clicks, so we have to be careful not to flagrantly facilitate that. One of the biggest problems contributing to the confusion is technical jargon changing over time and not often for the better. New folks will roll in, older folks will roll out, the industry will move forward and technology will move ahead, and all of this creates churn. The result is that industry terms end up getting used interchangeably by people that are not familiar with them, and then that behavior spreads. Who can tell me what a pen test is, right? Sales and marketing departments tend to use what I call creative latitude with industry terms to land sales or make their offerings seem more interesting, and this creates even more confusion. What's a red team? What's a pen test? What's a vuln scan? What is a security audit? Right? It gets dumber. Stay with me. So red teaming, by definition, like the people that invented the term, red team has no scope. If you're on an engagement and it's called a red team and there's a scope, it's not a red team. Sorry. The original term came from the military, where war games with opposing forces were simulated by a red team to basically stress test the defensive teams in an effort to identify areas of weaknesses in the event an actual enemy might find those weaknesses. To be blunt, they straight up pretend to be the enemy, a real enemy in a war game with guns. There's no rules in war, and the enemy will not follow a scope. So by definition, if an engagement has a scope, hit these servers or hit that website, you can only hit the QA, but it's not a red team. Pen testing, on the other hand, by definition, are dramatically different than red team engagements. Pen tests are usually done because of compliance reasons. Systems are compliant with some regulatory, or systems have to be compliant with some regulatory framework, PCI, SOX, HIPAA, NERC, FINRA, FISMA. There's one for hospitality I learned recently. Really? Hospitality? Okay. So they're very often very narrow in scope, and they're limited to a single website or a single server or a network segment or just a few machines, and they're constrained in other ways. They have obviously very clearly defined boundaries, and pen tests tend to address very specific concerns like, is my website PCI compliant? Is my vault PCI compliant? Can this network reach that network? They're very, very scoped, very narrow. They're meant to test a specific thing, and usually to show some regulatory body that specific thing is up to snuff. Bad sales pitches and marketing campaigns often confuse things as well, by confusing people who didn't understand the difference originally between the terms and basically digging us all in this huge collective hole. Having to begin security discussions by saying something like, the last thing you were told was horribly wrong, is effectively a bad place for anyone that's involved. If our goal collectively is to educate people, then we're stepping on our own feet. Take a look at these examples and see if they make any sense. Just try not to kill yourself. 6 reasons to hire a red team to harden your AppSec. Go home, you're drunk. Are you kidding me? I took these screenshots from websites that are selling these as services. You can pay these. I don't know who these companies were, and I'm trying to. I think I did a good enough job of hiding who they were. I don't even remember at this point. But open source active reconnaissance red team. What? Words. You can't use them. Seriously. Red team penetration testing. No, those are different. Blue team vulnerability assessments. No, that's not blue team work. Espionage simulation, red team penetration testing, ethical hacking. You're just throwing spaghetti at the fucking wall at this point. I get worked up over this stuff, but how do you have a conversation with people if you don't speak the same language? And people are just diluting this over and over and over again forever. And it just, start a business, I dare you. Right? One bad headline, for example, will ruin the day of many, many people. Here's an example of 3. These headlines literally had people in foreign countries scared for their lives. These are examples of journalists interchangeably using words to make people visit a website and not taking into account the repercussions of their actions. By saying things like backdoor and vulnerability, they are indicating very specific meanings, and it seems that they were unaware of that fact. The readers, however, were not. These particular headlines, if you remember, were very recently after the Vault 7 leaks happened, or if you aren't familiar with the Vault 7 leaks, WikiLeaks released a trove of data which was effectively a copy of the CIA's Confluence wiki that had documentation and manuals and screenshots of malware and tools that they use on operations. And one of them involved gaining access to the EFI BIOS on Macs and shelling both Android and iPhones, and you all may remember some screaming hair on fire type stuff about Samsung TVs spying on you. That all came out of the Vault 7 leaks. The trouble with these particular headlines is, in certain circumstances, being told that the tool that you're using for your crypto being readable by anybody effectively results squarely in pants being shat. If you're in the middle, for live example, you're in the Middle East and you're gay. Okay, doesn't sound very scary, except they will kill you for that. If they find out that you're gay, they literally cut off your head. So if you are gay and you're in the Middle East and you find out WhatsApp, anybody can spy on WhatsApp, suddenly all the things you've been saying on Grindr are in some database somewhere, you believe, cause for panic. So using words is very important, because if you don't use them right, you can cause a lot of problems. Sometimes you have to do research to get it right. Sometimes this means speaking very slowly and thinking very carefully about what you intend to say before you try to say it. It means avoiding putting yourself in a situation where you have to say, but you know what I meant. Having to say those words means that you messed it up the first time and you weren't able to get your message across. And that's kind of tough in of itself. Getting your message across the first time is a challenge, to be sure. You have to avoid saying something that you'll later have to backpedal out of, which means you have to think about what you're going to say. If you do it wrong, you may end up being quoted, producing screenshots or sound bites that you didn't intend to produce. You may find that these will work against you in the future. They will be used against you to not necessarily produce a counterpoint, but to get you off track. Rather than working towards your point, you're going to have to go back and try and correct yourself, and then immediately you're off topic. You'll be pulled into sidebar conversations. Your arguments will be attacked with logical fallacies. You may not even have an argument. You just may make a statement, and that statement may attract logically unsound arguments and commentary from the internet. People will try to get you to say something that you don't mean so that they can use your exact words out of context against you later. You aren't obligated to respond to random strangers, the press, or anybody else, and sometimes the safest play is to just ignore people. There is some lingual sleight of hand that you might be faced with, being drawn into a discussion or argument purely so that you can be proven wrong, so that the opposing view becomes right by default. This is very, very common. People on the internet will start fights and arguments just to be right, and then your role becomes that of a pawn to lose so that someone else may win. Be aware that in these circumstances there is usually a goal to prove a point to somebody else or to produce an expert having said something for the purposes of a screenshot that can be used in an article or something else to that effect. You may end up being farmed for quotes at your own expense. Getting stuck in a public debate on a social media platform will quickly attract everyone who believes they have an opinion on the topic, and any perceived weaknesses on your part will constitute a vulnerability that everyone will try to jump on. You'll quickly find out that the point that you were trying to make now is completely irrelevant while people try to eat you, rephrase your statements to fit their own narrative, misquote you, and turn the entire discussion into a giant melee of incorrectly used technical jargon and logical fallacies. You'll never actually make it to your point through the noise. Making it to your point isn't always straightforward either. Actions tend to speak louder than words. You can't run software that spies on you and call yourself a privacy advocate. You can't interchangeably use red team and vuln assessment and expect to be considered an expert in the field. You can't claim that you have imposter syndrome if you don't have any experience in the field. All of these will become roadblocks to your ability to speak intelligently to security topics because they will spark sidebar conversations and permit people to attack your character, which will drag you off point and into that melee of incorrectly used technical jargon and logical fallacies. I know all of this may sound like you're trying to walk a tightrope here, but it's pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. If you learn to identify logical fallacies and how they're used, that will help you greatly. Understanding what the outcome of answering a question will also help dramatically. It may not be good. Take a moment to assess if you are being led into a trap. It's possible that you're being baited. You may be the bait. Do your research and spend a couple of minutes Googling. Find answers. Most of the internet works asynchronously. If you elect to reply, you have no obligation to reply on the spot, and this will make a staggeringly effective difference in helping you get your message across. Here's a few examples of logical fallacies that you may encounter on your adventures through the internets. These tend to be things that begin conversations or steer them in an ominous direction, used to bait people into having arguments or into getting them to say specific phrases. A straw man, right? The straw man fallacy. You report a cross-site scripting bug to a news company, and the news company responds indicating that they now intend to sue you because you are a malicious hacker bent on stealing their employees' data. Who hasn't had that happen to them, right? This is basically Facebook. In a discussion about some topic, a person talking to you begins attacking your character instead of the topic of any of your arguments. The vast majority of internet discussion, as it turns out, and this basically devolves into name calling. Again, Facebook. The bandwagon argument, appealing to the popularity of something in an effort to presume that it's valid in some way. But everybody is using the Facebook mobile phone application. I don't care if it's actually spying on me. Everybody else is using it, so it's spying on them too. Who cares? False dichotomy, this is a good one. Presenting an option of only two choices when many more actually exist in reality. Either we backdoor crypto and law enforcement has access to everyone's private conversations, or the pedophiles and terrorists will roam free and we'll be unable to catch them. Right? Not news. False cause. My favorite example of this particular of this particular fallacy is the temperatures globally have been going up while the number of pirates have been going down. So this must clearly indicate that pirates actually cool the planet and all of this global warming nonsense is a hoax. Good job. Drank too much paint. Right? There's a lot of terms that people often use to describe themselves, and in almost every case, they're being used incorrectly. Two of them, specifically, that we see quite a lot are Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome. Dunning-Kruger, in short, is a cognitive bias whereby the person believes they are really good at something when in reality they are not. This is usually because they lack sufficient experience to adequately identify how good at something they actually are, and for some reason just presume that they're the best. This is usually the case when a person interviewing for a job rates themselves as a 10 out of 10 on any particular given topic, like programming languages or learned skills. They have not yet learned enough to properly gauge where they are in that skill range and just presume that they're the best. Has anybody ever done that in an interview? On a scale of 1 to 10, rate your Python experience. Somebody's like, 10! Get out. In fact, let me take you to the roof. Right? Yeah. Opposite, right? Polar opposite, imposter syndrome. People who have imposter syndrome believe that they are inadequate when really they're experts. To quote the excerpt from, I think, Wikipedia, despite external evidence of their competence, those exhibiting the syndrome remain convinced that they are frauds and do not deserve the success that they have achieved. Many people fake claiming to have imposter syndrome, hoping to convince people that they are experts by using simple reverse psychology. But fortunately for all of us, nobody who does this in security is an actual psychologist, so their self-diagnosis can be dismissed quite easily. There is almost never any evidence to support their claims, since it is required for even a basic diagnosis. This chart is effectively emerging between the two, and that green line is a symbolic representation of the beginning of this talk where I described getting into a hot air balloon and riding it straight up. The more you learn, the more you realize there is more to learn, and this turns into a thing where by some point you learn you know nothing. Despite the fact that people hail you as an expert, you're hovering in the stratosphere in this balloon saying, I don't know anything, I just know this little speck down there, and there's all this world of knowledge that I don't know yet. But everyone down in their little alcoves believes that they're experts end to end, right? The longer you spend learning, the more this becomes a reality. Only now do you know how much you know that you don't know, right? It is okay to ask for help. By and large, the information security community is happy to help, right? Ask anybody in the room. We need more talented hackers, and if that means walking somebody through a CTF or explaining how a buffer overflow works, we'll generally be very happy to do it. I've personally had people tell me that they avoid going to security conferences because they feel like they're too new and they don't want people to get the impression that they don't know anything. And my reply has always been, just be open about asking for help. You'll usually get an overwhelming response, or at the very least, get pointed in the right direction. For case in point, go talk to Lynn Tile up on 21 and say, I don't know how to CTF, show me how to hacks, bro. And he'll say, get a helmet, let's do it. Like, seriously, just ask for help. All the stuff is free, just people are giving it away. Napoleon said, when your enemy is making a mistake, do not correct them. On the internet, this means that you are not obligated to correct people when they're wrong. Right? I know, stay with me. Or even acknowledge that they have an opinion at any point. In many cases, they aren't in a position to speak to a particular topic in the first place, and engaging in a discussion with them will simply weaken your point. Abstaining will also lessen the amount of attack surface others can use to pull you off course or to get you to say things that they can use against you. It is okay to jump into discussions on the internet. You just have to be prepared. Being informed is not an insurmountable task. It just takes time. And the better you are informed, the more intelligent you will appear in these discussions. Avoiding responding to logical fallacies entirely will prevent more from showing up in the future, as it will be obvious that they don't work on you. Having strong communication skills will take you very far. You just have to take the time to improve those skills. It can only benefit you. If we do not ever take time, how can we ever have time, right? It is okay to have a sense of humor, and it is okay to joke around. Just make sure that there's a very clear distinction between when you're joking and when you're being serious. Lol theory is a great example. Using words incorrectly simply obliterates any seriousness or credibility that you have. If you want to be taken seriously, you have to be serious. Not all of the time, obviously, but it has to be very clear when you mean business and when you don't. If nobody can tell when you're being serious, nobody's going to take you seriously. So the goal here, effectively, is to positively change information security's effectiveness on the outside world, right? And this is absolutely a ridiculous uphill battle. Ask anybody that's talked to somebody wearing a tie. We're effectively charged with undoing poor work that came before us, only to try to do better work in its place, which comes out to be more time and effort than simply doing the work twice. This means that we have to work together, we have to communicate clearly amongst ourselves, and we have to send a unified message out of our own community so that everyone else knows that we're on the same page. The reason security isn't taken seriously is because we don't send a unified message. They see us fighting with each other, and they don't get the impression that we know what we're talking about. It appears as though we just want to be right on the internet, and beyond that, we don't care. And this absolutely has to change. We're starting to get quite a lot of attention from TV, movies, documentaries, lots of people trying to enter the security profession. All sorts of stuff like that puts us on television, radio, you name it. Information security is the next in line after doctors and lawyers to enter the major media, which means suddenly security and hacking are topics of everyday discussion. It means we're going to be getting a lot more questions from the general public, and we need to be prepared to take advantage of that opportunity to do good. So the less time we spend arguing with each other and the more the general public will take us seriously. And the more they take us seriously, the more professional we will appear to them. The more professional we appear to the general public, the greater impact we're going to have when we make recommendations, give advice, explain why something is good or bad, or provide direction in any capacity. I understand that looking professional isn't always at the top of everybody's agenda, but in some cases it is objectively avoided. We just have to take the time to get this right. So Nelson Mandela once said, "Everything is impossible until it is done." Well, you now find yourselves in a room full of very smart people. We are all in this community together, and if we work together, we are literally capable of world-changing things. So go forth, make friends, and let's show the world how the InfoSec do. Thank you very much for your time. And I think I went really fast. So I have like a bunch of time for questions, or somebody wants to throw a knife or wrestle or whatever. Comments? Know who they are. Because if you, well, okay, do 10 seconds of OSINT on them before you're an expert in something, and they're like, no, you're bullshit. And you go and you look at who they are, and if it's like Bill Maher, millions of followers, you're like, well, shit, okay, I have to think about this now, right? Because now any response you send is going to millions of people. But it's a Twitter egg with 0 followers, fuck it. I have a gift. Oh, I have a gift for this. I should have put it in the talk. Anyone else? Questions, comments, knives, hate mail, cupcakes, aircraft, explosives, Ode? Drinking? Poison. Oh.
Pretty general question, I guess.
Sure.
But I've been formally in the security community for like 9 months, I guess.
Okay.
I've been attending cons and whatnot. But I
Sure.
guess, like, what sort of advice do you give to someone that's just sort of getting their bearings and whatnot, like sort of starting out? Pretty general, but.
What's your objective?
I guess, I don't know. I'm looking to do like blue team type stuff. That's what I'm doing right now in my role, like security engineer.
Okay. Well, you ever seen Stargate?
No, I haven't.
Okay. In the beginning of the movie, there's this whole. Right. So in the beginning of the movie, there's this whole spiel about how do you plot a course.
Sure.
Right. You need 6 points of data to plot a point in 3-dimensional space, but then you need a 7th point to actually plot a course. So if you don't know what you want to do, it's hard to define how to get there. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Well, I can't really tell you how to get there if you don't know where you want to go. There's a lot of blue teamers in the crowd. There are several people here, depending if they show up or not, who may or may not have written books on the topic. I would encourage you to find them and put beer into them, or their fluid of choice. Could be motor oil, I don't know. People are weird, man. The internet's full of, So, I encourage you, be social, talk to people, ask questions. Most people are happy to oblige. Go to cons, do CTFs. One of the best ways to learn how to defend is to learn how to attack, which seems weird. But if you know how to break things, then you know how people break things. And if you know how people break things, you have a pretty good idea of how to erect defenses against those things. And, conversely, it's the same sort of thing. If you came up in sysadmin, you came up on blue team, and you want to get into breaking things, the exact opposite thing. If you know how stuff works, you can break it better, right? The people that are some of the most effective attackers I know are people that started out in networking or started out in dev. They did dev for like 8 to 10 years, and they said, screw it, I want to burn the world. And now they're write Ode, right? And if you write Ode, then you're like a wizard. Right, and same thing on the networking side. If you gain access to an ASA somewhere, and the CISPs in the room are like, what's an ASA, and you're like, I have all your VLANs. I'm just going to mirror everything to my box, and now I have absolutely everything. Speaking of absolutely everything, Responder's been running for like, ooh. Speaking of attacking, right? Like, meh. If you know how broadcasts work and you know how networks work, like. There's some stuff you can get up to. No hashes yet. But yeah, fun times. So, yeah, that being the case, everything is interconnected. Red team and blue team are kind of mushed up together in the center. There's a lot of overlapping topics. It's literally the same thing, the same architecture, the same networks, the same operating systems, you're looking at it from a different point of view, right? So Active Directory is Active Directory. Whether you're standing it up or whether you're breaking into it, you have to understand kind of how it works. So just be social, ask lots of questions. There's lots of people here that are probably happy to help you. A great way of starting out is to find somebody that has some ridiculous war story and be like, regale me with your crazy stories. Like, tell me some crazy shit you did. Like, one of my favorite interview questions when I'm interviewing people to do attack stuff is, what's the craziest pen test you've been on? And just let them talk for like an hour. Same thing. Just ask, like, what's the craziest incident response thing you ever had to deal with? And they go, I'm going to need like 5 drinks for this. And then the waitress comes over. There you go. You're in. Yeah, get a helmet. You're in for a ride.
No, I saw your live pen test a while back, and I really like that. I've read like other like pen test reports and whatnot, but like stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Anybody else? More questions?
I was going to go back to Twitter and social media.
Yep.
We all live on it. What if you embarrass yourself, like you said, and get a troll or someone's believing you? What's the safest, most efficient way to disengage from that?
Have you ever done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or any other martial art? Don't give them a limb. Don't give them attack surface. Every time you reply, you're giving them attack surface. It doesn't matter what you say, how intelligent you say it. It doesn't matter if you spend 3 hours researching it. If somebody's just going to fuck with you mercilessly, every single time you engage with them, you are presenting to them attack surface that they will take advantage of. So literally just bail. Punch out of the whole discussion. Pretend like they're not even there. It's basically a long-winded way of saying don't feed the trolls. I know it's difficult because I know some people will say some things that you're like, no, you're wrong. But if you perpetuate the cycle of trying to correct people that are wrong on the internet, like I described this at another con recently as if the internet is a dumpster fire, or if this discussion is a dumpster fire, the closer you get to the dumpster fire, the more you will end up smelling like burning trash. Right? Seems to make sense. So like, you don't want to smell like burning trash, walk away. Let the dumpster burn. You don't have to put it out. Just enjoy the warmth. Right? Like, they're on fire. Fuck them, whatever. Like, nobody's holding a gun to your head to engage with these people. Unless it's your company, in which case, then they can deal with it. But generally speaking, if somebody's giving you a bunch of grief on the internet, and it's BS, there's literally no reason to ever bother responding, because the only thing that keeps the conversation going is if you reply. Let people be wrong. Who cares? More? Yes? No? Okay. Well, I will give you back 21 minutes of your lives. Thank you very much.